Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk you through a lesson plan for teaching generic resume design. Now, this is something that you could take to a number of different classes. I teach business and professional writing, but you could teach this in any kind of class where you would be teaching resume design or resume structure. So what I start out by doing is telling students that there are an infinite number of recommendations, an infinite number of arguments, advice about how to design resumes. There's no hard and fast single way of designing resumes. And in fact, anybody who gives you advice will give you different advice than anybody else. So I actually invite my students to make recommendations or to share tips and advice that they have gotten in other contexts so that we get as much information as possible about how to design a resume effectively. Then I give my students a generic resume model. Now this is just one that I've designed. It says like generic student at the top. It says, I don't know, the addresses are like 123 Hometown Street or things like this. So it's just, there's no specific information. It's not a real world resume. It is very much a template type thing. Then I give them a few minutes to look it over and identify as much stuff about it as they can. So what design elements or visual elements do they notice? What organization do they notice? Or what information, how is the information organized? How is the information presented or described? Things like this. I make it very, very open so that they can identify whatever jumps out at them. Because ultimately, almost all elements of resume design are significant. And so whatever they notice is likely to be something that's worth discussing. So then I have them start, as in a full class discussion, I have them start pointing out things that they notice. And I talk about why those things matter. I do also promise that I will give them the rationale between the rationale behind the design advice that I give for resumes. So I try and explain not just here's what this resume does or here's how to approach this particular element of resume building, but here's why as well. And your relative ability to do that will depend on how much time you've spent thinking about resumes. That's not necessarily a huge problem if you're not that familiar with it. You give them whatever advice you can based on whatever you know about the principles of resume design as a rhetorical exercise and based on what real-world employers are looking for. Because those are really the two key things. So typically I talk them through a number of elements of resume design, many of which students tend to bring up themselves, but some of which I introduce because they're important. So for instance, the three crucial things that I think every resume absolutely needs at a bare minimum are contact information, education, and work experience. Because these are the three most important things from a potential employer's perspective. So we talk about that. We talk about what kinds of information should be included in the contact information. At the very least, it should be your name, an email address, and probably a phone number. Most people will include a street address or like a temporary address and a permanent address, maybe a work address and a home address, something like that. That's very, very traditional, very, very important for a society that primarily communicates via hard mail. But for an increasingly digital society, employers may not be as concerned about it. You can also include things like a personal website or a LinkedIn profile. These are things that increasingly people are starting to do, but these are options that students have. So we talk about those things. We talk about how to set up the education entry. And in a way, that's kind of basic one, because you need obviously the school, you need the degree, you need the program, you need the either actual or expected date of graduation. So those are the minimum key things. Sometimes people will say include the location of the school. I don't think that's crucial, but I don't think it's a bad thing to include. The one that students sometimes ask about or are unsure about is GPA. Anyway, this is all details. This is I've done a video on generic resume design where I talk through a lot of these things. But basically, you go through, you have students identify things in the resume, things that jump out at them, and you talk through them with the students. You explain why you do things in particular ways within a resume, etc., etc. If there's anything that they don't cover, anything that they don't say, obviously you sort of fill in those gaps. And again, I would maybe come back and just periodically encourage students to share any resume design advice they've gotten in other contexts. How often you want to do that is up to you. But once we've gotten through the end of talking about the generic resume model with some of the big resume design and organization principles, I will have taped up before class on the board three differently designed resumes. They're all the first page of my CV. So the information is the same in all of them, but visually they're quite different. So I should have gotten these out beforehand, because I can hold these up for you so you can take a look at them. So I've got this version, I've got this version, and I've got this version. Now you can create your own ones of these, but basically the way that I've approached this is this first resume design. This is the one that I actually use. So I've just sort of taken this directly from my own CV setup. This one is based on the Smeal Business School template. So here at Penn State, where I work, the business school, Smeal, has a very specific template that they want their students to use. I sort of reverse engineered it based on seeing a number of student versions of it. And so this is a rough approximation of what that looks like. And then with this one, I decided to go with very white space heavy, very left aligned, very sleek and modern as a style. So you want your three resume designs to look relatively different. They all should be doing good resume stuff, good design principles, but different logics, different organization behind those design principles. So I have taped these three resume designs up on the board, and I ask students to stand up and walk to the front of the board and look at the three different designs and identify what works well and what doesn't work, maybe. Especially focus on what works well in each of these three resume designs and decide which one they think is most visually effective. And then we talk about it. I start by taking a vote to how many people thought resume 1 was the most visually effective, resume 2, resume 3, and we figure out what the most popular one was. Sometimes you will have pretty much everybody on board with one resume design. Like in my first class that I taught the day that I'm filming this, everybody preferred resume 2. In my second section, there was a more even distribution. But then you can go through. So like if you've got a situation where almost everybody or everybody is on board with one of the resume designs, start by talking about that one and have the students explain what they think was effective about it. If you've got a more even distribution, I would start and just go 1, 2, 3 and have students talk about what visually works with each of the resumes. But you want to, I think, talk about all 3 resumes and what the guiding logic behind them is, so that, again, students start getting a sense of the design principles they should be thinking about and what factors they should be considering. The other thing that I have done with these 3 resume designs is I've done a different thing with the font with each of them. So the first resume design is all in a serif font, Bell MT, which happens to be the font that I personally like best. So all my job materials are in Bell MT. The second resume design uses a varied approach where the section headings are in a serif font, again, Bell MT, and the information within the sections itself is in a sans serif font, which in this case I think is Calibri. And then the third resume is all in a sans serif font, Century Gothic in this case. And I talked to them about, and we have already briefly gone over this earlier in the semester, and we've come back to it with a later project, but I talked to them briefly about why you might choose a serif font or a sans serif font or a blend of both. I talk about the reasons for doing this. And I've covered that as well in a different video on serif and sans serif fonts. But again, it's an important design choice for resumes and something that they want to be thinking about in terms of how their reader is actually going to encounter this document. Are they going to be reading it on a screen? Are they going to be reading it on a physical page? Do you want to create dynamic visual interest by switching it up? Or do you want to create consistency and coherence by using the same font, etc., etc.? So that's the basic approach that I take with teaching generic resume design. We spend the bulk of the class talking about this generic resume template I've created, and we talk about these design principles and organization principles, and then we take a look at a few different design approaches to get a better sense of how these actually work in practice.